The
I see
moment my
retirement hasn't
daughter-in-law
made your
called me
cooking any
useless,
more
the
palatable,
entire
Mother.
Christmas table went silent. The candles were still burning. Snow was falling outside my Connecticut home. My son stared at his plate as if he suddenly couldn't remember how to look at his own mother. Vanessa lifted her wine glass and laughed softly. "Let's be honest,"
I
she
only
said.
wanted the truth.
"Summer doesn't contribute anything anymore. She's just useless." My
Merry
hands
Christmas,
began to
David.
shake beneath the tablecloth. After 40 years of marriage, decades of raising my son, and a lifetime of sacrifice, I had never felt smaller. I was about to stand up and leave my own dining room when someone knocked on the front door. 3 slow knocks, and the man standing outside would change all of our lives forever. If you've ever felt invisible inside your own family, I'd love to hear your story. Please like and subscribe if these conversations about family love and healing speak to you. Leave a comment and tell me how this moment makes you feel. And if you're watching from somewhere in the world tonight, tell me your location and what time it is where you are. Sometimes, knowing we're not alone makes all the difference. My name is Summer West, and by the time I turned 68, I had learned something that no woman ever wants to admit. Loneliness does not begin when your husband dies. It begins when the people you love slowly stop seeing you. For almost 43 years, I was married to Ethan West. He was the kind of man who rarely raised his voice, always wore pressed shirts, and never left the house without kissing my forehead. People in our town in Connecticut respected him. Some admired him. Many thought he was successful because of his business sense. But the truth was much simpler. Ethan always said that whatever he became in life happened because someone stayed behind and held everything together. That someone was me. When Michael was born, Ethan had just started building his consulting company. Money was tight. We lived in a small 2-bedroom house with squeaky floors and a leaking roof. Ethan worked long hours while I worked part-time at the library. I still remember sitting at our kitchen table late at night, balancing bills while our son slept upstairs. There were months when we had exactly $30 left after paying the mortgage. Months when Ethan worried he had made a mistake starting his own company. Months when I quietly sold jewelry my mother had left me so our son could attend summer camp. I never told Ethan, and I never regretted it. As the years passed, Ethan's company slowly became successful. We moved into the larger colonial house where this story takes place. The White House with blue shutters became our dream home. We planted maple trees in the backyard. We built a sunroom where Ethan liked to read newspapers every Sunday morning. Michael grew up there. He learned to ride his bicycle on that driveway. He graduated from high school in our backyard. He brought home his first girlfriend there. Every corner of that house carried pieces of our family. Then 7 years ago, everything changed. Ethan suffered a heart attack while attending a business conference in Chicago. He was gone before I could even reach the hospital. People tell you that grief comes like a storm. For me, it came like silence. The silence of 1 coffee cup instead of 2. The silence of sleeping alone. The silence of hearing the garage door and realizing nobody was coming home. Michael was 35 then. He lived nearly 2 hours away with his wife, Vanessa. They visited occasionally, mostly during holidays. After Ethan died, they began calling more often. At first, I felt grateful. Vanessa would ask if I was eating properly. Michael would remind me to lock the doors at night. They seemed concerned. They seemed loving. Looking back now, I wonder if I confused attention with affection. About 2 years after Ethan passed away, Michael sat with me in the sunroom. The autumn leaves were falling outside. He looked nervous. "Mom," he said, "Vanessa and I have been thinking." I smiled. Whenever a child says those words, a mother prepares herself. "Our apartment is getting expensive, and honestly, we worry about you living alone." Vanessa immediately added, "Families should stay together." The idea sounded reasonable. I was getting older. The house felt empty. And if I'm being honest, I missed hearing voices in the kitchen. I missed family dinners. I missed laughter. So I agreed. I told them they could move in temporarily. That was my first mistake. The first few weeks seemed wonderful. Michael fixed a broken cabinet. Vanessa brought flowers into the kitchen. We watched movies together. We shared meals. For the first time in years, the house felt alive again. But little things began changing. Vanessa replaced my curtains because they looked old-fashioned. She donated several pieces of furniture because they were too outdated. She reorganized my kitchen. She moved Ethan's favorite chair into the basement because it didn't fit the aesthetic. I told myself not to complain. Young people decorate differently. Young people have different tastes. That is what I kept repeating. Then, one afternoon, I walked into my own bedroom and found Vanessa measuring the walls. "Oh," she said casually. "I was just seeing if this room would work better for Michael and me." I laughed because I thought she was joking. She wasn't. A month later, I moved into the smaller downstairs bedroom. Vanessa explained that climbing stairs was becoming difficult for older people. I had never once complained about the stairs, but Michael agreed. "It might actually be safer, Mom." Safer. That word stayed with me. Sometimes people use kind words to hide uncomfortable truths. The truth was simple. My house was slowly becoming theirs. Around that same time, my closest friend, Grace Parker, began noticing changes in me. Grace and I had been friends for nearly 30 years. She lost her husband 5 years before I lost Ethan. She understood grief. She understood loneliness. One afternoon, we sat together at a small cafe downtown. She stirred her coffee and looked directly at me. "Are you happy they're living there?" I hesitated. "I think so." She frowned. "You think so?" I looked down. "I just don't want Michael to feel responsible for me." Grace reached across the table. "Summer, there's a difference between family helping you and family taking over." I immediately defended Michael. "He would never hurt me." Grace nodded slowly. "I'm not worried about Michael." I knew exactly who she meant, but I didn't answer. Several weeks later, I found Ethan's old desk key while cleaning the garage. Inside the desk drawer sat a thick envelope. My name was written on the front. Summer. Only that. No date, no instructions, nothing else. I remember holding the envelope for several minutes. My heart began beating faster. Ethan had always been organized, careful, deliberate. If he left something behind, there was a reason. For some reason, I didn't open it. Instead, I placed it back inside the drawer. Sometimes grief makes strange decisions for us. Sometimes we avoid the things we need most. That same evening, I noticed Vanessa watching me. "What were you doing in the garage?" she asked. "Oh, just cleaning." "Did you find anything important?" The question seemed harmless, yet something in her voice made me uncomfortable. I smiled. "Just old papers." She stared at me for a moment longer than necessary. Then she smiled. Christmas was only 3 weeks away. Vanessa had already begun decorating the house. She invited friends. She ordered expensive decorations. She planned a large dinner. Everyone kept saying how wonderful Christmas would be. But for reasons I couldn't explain, I found myself waking up in the middle of the night. Sometimes I would sit alone in the kitchen. Sometimes I would look at Ethan's photograph. And sometimes I would remember his final words to me before that business trip. "If anything ever happens, trust yourself, Summer." At the time, I thought he was talking about grief. I didn't realize he might have been warning me about something else entirely. And as Christmas approached, I began to understand that the house Ethan and I built together was quietly changing around me. The walls were the same. The furniture looked different. The people inside had changed. And for the first time in my life, I started feeling like a guest inside my own home. There is a strange kind of theft that doesn't involve money. No police officer can arrest it. No insurance company covers it. It happens quietly, one small piece at a time, until one day you wake up and realize someone has stolen your place in your own life. That was what Vanessa was doing to me. At first, I told myself I was imagining things. Older women often doubt themselves. We spend decades keeping peace inside our families. We learn to ignore our own discomfort because we don't want to appear difficult. We convince ourselves that sacrifice is love. But sacrifice and surrender are not the same thing. The first major argument happened over Ethan's chair. It was an old leather recliner that sat beside the fireplace in the family room. Ethan had spent hundreds of evenings there reading newspapers, watching baseball, or simply resting after work. After he died, I could never bring myself to move it. Sometimes I would sit there myself. Sometimes I would simply touch the worn armrest and remember his hand resting there. One Saturday afternoon, I walked downstairs and stopped in the middle of the room. The chair was gone. In its place stood a modern glass cabinet filled with decorative candles. "Where's Ethan's chair?" I asked. Vanessa didn't even look up from her tablet. "We moved it." She smiled. "Michael helped me. It didn't match the room anymore." I felt my throat tighten. "Where is it?" "In the basement." The basement, as if 40 years of marriage could be stored beside old paint cans and Christmas decorations. Michael entered the room carrying groceries. "Mom, Vanessa's just trying to update things a little." I looked at my son. "Your father's chair." He avoided my eyes. "It's only furniture." Only furniture. Perhaps to him it was. To me, it was the last place Ethan had sat before leaving for Chicago. I wanted to argue. I wanted to tell him that memories matter. Instead, I quietly walked downstairs. The chair sat in the corner beneath a bare light bulb. Dust had already settled on the armrests. I sat down. For the first time in years, I cried. Not because of the chair, because I suddenly understood that the things I loved could disappear while I was still alive to watch them leave. Over the following months, the changes continued. Vanessa repainted the dining room. She replaced family photographs with abstract artwork. She boxed up several old decorations because they looked dated. Even my kitchen became unfamiliar. One morning, I opened a cabinet looking for my favorite teacups. They were gone. After searching for nearly 15 minutes, I found them in a storage box inside the garage. Vanessa noticed me carrying them back inside. "Oh, I thought those were old." "They belong to my mother." She shrugged. "We need to declutter." That word became one of her favorites. Declutter. Simplify. Modernize. Refresh. Every word sounded harmless, but somehow the things being removed always belonged to me. Meanwhile, Vanessa filled the house with expensive decorations. Designer pillows, imported candles, large pieces of artwork. She spent money easily, far more easily than Michael ever had. I began noticing delivery trucks almost every week. New furniture, new electronics, new decorations. One afternoon, Grace came to visit. She walked through the front door and stopped. "Did I come to the wrong house?" she joked. I laughed, although it wasn't funny. We sat in the kitchen drinking coffee. Grace lowered her voice. Summer, are you okay? Of course. No, really. I looked around. The kitchen suddenly felt unfamiliar. Even the curtains were different. I suppose things change. Grace studied me carefully. Whose house is this now? I couldn't answer, because the answer frightened me. A few days later, I heard Vanessa speaking on the phone. I wasn't trying to listen. I had simply come downstairs to make tea. I know, she said. It's a beautiful property. She laughed. Once everything is settled, we'll have plenty of options. I stopped walking. The location alone is worth a fortune. My heart began beating faster. Was she talking about my house? Before I could hear more, she noticed me standing nearby. Her smile appeared instantly. Oh, Summer, I didn't hear you. What were you talking about? Nothing important. She ended the call. But something had changed. For the first time, I felt afraid. That evening, Michael sat beside me in the sunroom. He seemed nervous. Mom Vanessa was wondering if you've updated your paperwork. What paperwork? You know, wills, property documents, things like that. I stared at him. Why? He shrugged. It's just responsible. I looked through the window toward the backyard. The maple trees Ethan planted had lost most of their leaves. Winter was coming. So, suddenly, everyone is interested in paperwork. Michael sighed. You're making this sound strange. Because it felt strange. For 7 years after Ethan died, nobody asked about documents. Now the subject appeared almost every week. A few days later, I found Vanessa standing outside my bedroom. She held a tape measure. What are you doing? I asked. She smiled. Just planning. Planning what? She hesitated. We've been thinking that eventually Michael and I may need more space. I felt cold. This is your space now. She laughed. Oh, not immediately. Not immediately. Those words stayed with me. At church the following Sunday, Grace sat beside me. After the service, she asked me to lunch. Halfway through our meal, she said something that upset me. I think Vanessa wants your house. I immediately defended her. That's ridiculous. Is it? Michael would never allow that. Grace folded her hands. Sometimes good men allow bad things because they're afraid of conflict. I looked down at my coffee. Michael hated arguments. Even as a child, he would leave the room if people raised their voices. Vanessa knew that. She always spoke confidently. She always decided things. Michael usually agreed, not because he wanted to, because it was easier. As Christmas approached, Vanessa became obsessed with hosting the perfect holiday dinner. She ordered expensive decorations. She hired caterers. She invited people I had never met. Friends from her social club, business associates, neighbors she barely knew. When I asked about the guest list, she replied casually, "We need to make connections." Connections? It seemed strange for a family dinner. One afternoon, I opened the hallway closet and discovered several boxes. Inside them were many of my belongings: photo albums, holiday decorations, old quilts, even some of Ethan's books. I carried one box into the living room. Vanessa looked up. Oh, I packed those. Why? We need more storage space. I ran my fingers across one of our old Christmas ornaments. Ethan and I had bought it during our first year of marriage. It suddenly felt as though someone had packed away pieces of my life. That night, I couldn't sleep. I walked quietly through the house. The Christmas tree glowed softly in the darkness. The house was beautiful, but it no longer felt like mine. As I passed the kitchen, I heard voices. Michael and Vanessa. I stopped. We have to do it after Christmas, Vanessa whispered. Michael answered quietly. I don't know. We can't keep living like this. There was silence. Then Vanessa spoke again. She'll understand eventually. My hands began trembling. Who would understand when I walked back to my room before they could see me? For the first time since Ethan died, I locked my bedroom door. And as I lay awake listening to the winter wind outside, I realized something terrifying. I had spent my entire life protecting my family, but I had never considered that one day I might need protection from them. By the first week of December, Christmas had completely taken over my house. Or perhaps I should say Vanessa's Christmas had taken over my house. The decorations began arriving before Thanksgiving was even over. Large boxes filled our front hallway. Delivery trucks stopped almost every day. Expensive ornaments, artificial garlands, decorative lanterns, and crystal centerpieces appeared in every room. Vanessa supervised everything. She stood in the living room holding a tablet while workers installed new lights around the windows. "No higher," she instructed. "The neighbors need to see them from the street." I stood nearby holding an old box of ornaments that Ethan and I had collected during our marriage. Small wooden angels, hand-painted snowmen, a glass ornament Michael made in 3rd grade. I smiled softly. "I thought we could put some of these on the tree." Vanessa barely looked at them. "Oh, those don't really match the color scheme." "Color scheme?" I looked down at the little snowman Michael had painted when he was 9 years old. The paint was chipped. The smile was crooked. It was perfect. "We can put them somewhere else," she continued. "Maybe the downstairs tree." Downstairs tree. The tiny tree sitting near my bedroom. The tree for things that no longer belonged upstairs. That evening, I carefully placed Michael's old ornament on the smaller tree alone. Sometimes mothers quietly protect memories because nobody else remembers why they matter. As the days passed, Vanessa became increasingly busy. She spoke constantly about the Christmas dinner. The guest list grew larger. The menu became more expensive. She hired a florist from Hartford. She ordered special wine. She rented additional chairs. One afternoon, I asked a simple question. "How many people are coming?" She looked at her phone. "About 22. I nearly dropped the dish I was holding. 22? She smiled. "It's important." "For whom?" "Our future." The answer confused me. Christmas had never been about networking in our family. It had always been simple. Ethan carved the turkey. Michael hung stockings. We listened to old Christmas records. We laughed. But Vanessa's Christmas seemed to be something else entirely. A performance, a presentation, an opportunity. Several days later, Grace came over to help me bake cookies. For 30 years, she and I had baked together every December. Chocolate chip, gingerbread, sugar cookies. Some traditions survive everything. We sat at the kitchen table rolling dough when Vanessa entered. "Oh, good," she said. "Can you ladies use the smaller kitchen tomorrow?" I looked up. "The smaller kitchen?" "The downstairs kitchenette." Grace frowned. "Why?" Vanessa smiled politely. "The caterers need this space." I stared at her. "This is Christmas baking." "The professionals need room." After Vanessa left, Grace slowly placed her rolling pin down. "Summer." "What?" "She's moving you out of your own kitchen." I immediately defended Vanessa. "She's just stressed." Grace looked directly at me. "No, she's establishing territory." Those words stayed with me long after she left. That evening, Michael came home later than usual. He looked exhausted. His tie hung loose around his neck. Vanessa immediately began discussing the dinner. "The Bennetts are coming." "Good. And the Carters." "Okay. And Richard Lawson." Michael stopped. "Richard Lawson? His company invests in real estate." I noticed the way Vanessa's eyes lit up. She wasn't talking about Christmas. She was talking about opportunities, investments, connections. I quietly washed dishes while they spoke. Then I heard something that made me freeze. The property alone will impress them. Property, not house, not home. Property. Michael noticed me standing still. Mom. I forced a smile. I'm just tired. That night, I went into Ethan's old office. Nobody used it anymore. Most of his books remained exactly where he left them. The room smelled faintly of cedar and old paper. I opened his desk drawer. The envelope was still there. My name. Summer. Nothing else. I touched it gently. For several moments, I considered opening it, but fear stopped me. Perhaps I wasn't ready. Perhaps I feared discovering that Ethan truly was gone. Or perhaps I feared learning something I didn't want to know. I placed the envelope back. As I turned to leave, I noticed several file folders missing. I stood still. I was certain they had once occupied the lower drawer. Property records, insurance papers, tax documents. I searched carefully. Nothing. The next morning, I asked Michael, "Have you been in your father's office?" He hesitated. A little. Were there some files in the bottom drawer? His eyes moved away. Vanessa was organizing some things. My stomach tightened. What things? Just paperwork. I didn't ask further, but I couldn't stop thinking about it. A few days later, I overheard another conversation. Vanessa was speaking on the phone again. This time she sounded frustrated. No, she hasn't signed anything. I stopped in the hallway. I know. Silence. After Christmas will be easier. My heart began pounding. After Christmas. The same words I had heard before. I stepped backward before she saw me. That afternoon, I called Grace. She arrived within an hour. We sat in the sunroom while snow began falling outside. I think something is happening, I said. Grace listened quietly. When I finished, she took my hand. Have you looked at your documents? No. Why not? Because I trusted my family. Because I didn't want conflict. Because mothers spend their entire lives believing love will protect them. I don't know. Grace leaned closer. Summer promised me something. What? Before Christmas? Look at everything. I nodded, but part of me still resisted. I wanted Michael to be the boy who once slept with his teddy bear. I wanted him to be the child who ran into my arms after school. I wanted to believe he would never allow anyone to hurt me. Yet every day he seemed quieter, smaller, as if he were disappearing behind his marriage. 3 days before Christmas, Vanessa handed me an envelope. We'll discuss this after dinner on Christmas Eve. I looked down. What is it? Just some ideas. About what? Our future. Again that word. Future. She smiled. You deserve to relax. I already relax. You know what I mean. No, I didn't. But something inside me already knew. That evening, I sat alone beside the downstairs Christmas tree. The small one. The forgotten one. Michael's ornament hung near the top. Ethan's favorite angel rested beside it. I suddenly realized that nearly every meaningful object from my life had been moved downstairs with me. The photographs, the ornaments, the quilts, the books, the memories. Perhaps Vanessa hadn't simply redecorated. Perhaps she had slowly relocated my entire existence. The next morning, I visited Ethan's grave. The cemetery was covered in fresh snow. I brushed the stone clean with my gloves. I don't know what to do, I whispered. The winter wind answered nothing. But I remembered something Ethan often said. When people show you who they are, believe them. As I drove home, Christmas lights glowed along the streets. Families prepared for celebrations. Children waited for presents. And somewhere, deep inside me, a terrible feeling continued to grow. The Christmas dinner Vanessa had planned wasn't meant to bring the family together. It was meant to change something. Perhaps everything. And whatever waited after Christmas was already moving toward me. I simply couldn't see it yet. Christmas Eve arrived beneath a gray Connecticut sky. Snow covered the neighborhood, and every house on our street seemed wrapped in warm yellow lights. Children built snowmen. Families carried wrapped presents inside. Somewhere nearby, church bells rang softly through the cold afternoon air. From the outside, my home looked perfect. Inside, I felt as if I were waiting for something terrible. I woke before sunrise. For several minutes, I lay in bed listening to the house. The heating system hummed. Pipes clicked. Someone walked upstairs. Then silence. Ethan always loved Christmas Eve. He would wake early and make coffee before anyone else. He would stand at the kitchen window watching the snow and say the same thing every year. This house feels alive today. That morning, the house felt nervous. I dressed slowly and walked upstairs. The kitchen already belonged to the caterers. 3 women unpacked trays of food. A man carried boxes through the dining room. Vanessa stood in the middle of everything holding a clipboard. She looked more like an event manager than a daughter-in-law. "Oh, good, you're up," she said. "I always wake early." She smiled politely. "Could you stay downstairs for a while? They're still setting up?" I stared at her. "This is my kitchen." "I know. It's just easier." Easier. Everything seemed easier when I disappeared. I made myself coffee in the small downstairs kitchenette. As I sat alone, I noticed something on the counter. An envelope. White. Folded. My name was written on the front. Summer West. The handwriting wasn't Ethan's. It was Vanessa's. For several moments, I simply stared at it. Then I opened it. Inside was a brochure. A retirement community. Beautiful photographs. Gardens. Dining halls. Private rooms. Activities. The words, Independent Senior Living, appeared across the top. My hands became cold. At the bottom of the brochure, Vanessa had written, "We'll discuss this tonight. We only want what's best for you." I read the sentence 3 times. Only want what's best for you. Suddenly, the conversations made sense. After Christmas, paperwork, future, relax, more space. My chest tightened. I sat there for nearly 20 minutes, unable to move. When Grace arrived shortly before noon, she immediately knew something was wrong. "What happened?" I handed her the brochure. She read it quietly. Then she looked directly at me. "Did Michael know?" "I don't know." "Summer, this isn't a suggestion." "What do you mean, this is preparation?" I felt tears gathering. "They wouldn't do this." Grace sat beside me. "Honey, they already are." The words hurt because they sounded true. Upstairs, I could hear laughter. Guests had not yet arrived, but Vanessa was already moving through the house with confidence, as if everything belonged to her. Around 2 o'clock, Michael finally came downstairs. He looked tired. I handed him the brochure. His face immediately changed. "Mom, what is this?" He sat down. "It's just information." "Information for what?" He rubbed his forehead. "Vanessa thinks you might be happier somewhere with people your age." People my age? as if age itself had become a disease. I have neighbors. I know. I have friends. I know. I have this house. He remained silent. That silence hurt more than any words. I looked directly at my son. Do you want me to leave? He looked down at his hands. I just want everyone to be happy. I suddenly understood something. Michael was not cruel, but weakness can wound people just as deeply as cruelty. Sometimes the people who fail to protect you cause the greatest pain. He stood. We'll talk later. When? After dinner, again. Everything waited until after Christmas. As evening approached, guests began arriving. Luxury cars lined the street. Women in expensive coats entered the house. Men carried bottles of wine. Everyone admired the decorations. The house is gorgeous. Vanessa, you've done an incredible job. This place is stunning. Nobody said it was my house. Perhaps nobody knew. Vanessa introduced people. This is our home. Our. The word struck me every time. Grace stayed beside me most of the evening. Without her, I think I would have gone upstairs and hidden. At one point, I walked into Ethan's office. I needed a moment alone. The room remained quiet while the sounds of the party floated through the walls. My eyes fell upon the desk. The envelope. My envelope. Still waiting. I opened the drawer. For several seconds, I held it in my hands. My name. Summer. My fingers trembled. Then I heard footsteps. Vanessa stood in the doorway. Oh, there you are. I quickly placed the envelope back. Everyone's looking for you. I needed a moment. She looked around the office. We should probably organize this room eventually. I said nothing. So much old paperwork. Again, paperwork. She smiled. We'll figure everything out after dinner. When she left, I noticed something strange. The lower drawer of Ethan's desk was slightly open. Inside were folders, but not the ones I remembered. Someone had searched through this desk. Someone had moved things. I suddenly realized that I no longer trusted the people living in my house. That realization frightened me. By 6 o'clock, the dining room was filled. Candles burned. Wine glasses sparkled. Christmas music played softly. 22 people sat around the table. Many of them were strangers. Vanessa sat at one end, Michael beside her. I sat halfway down the table beside Grace. For a while, everything seemed normal. Turkey, potatoes, laughter, stories. But underneath the conversation, I felt tension building. Vanessa kept glancing at Michael. Michael avoided her eyes. Several guests asked me questions. How long have you lived here? When did you buy this beautiful house? Do you enjoy living with your son? I answered politely, but Vanessa answered many questions herself. She spoke about renovations, future plans, space, changes. Then one of the women smiled at me. It must be wonderful having your family take care of you. Before I could answer, Vanessa laughed softly. We do our best. The room became quieter. Vanessa lifted her wine glass. You know it's difficult sometimes. Michael looked at her. Vanessa. She ignored him. People don't realize how much responsibility comes with taking care of someone. My heart began beating faster. The guests exchanged uncertain looks. Grace reached for my hand beneath the table. Vanessa continued. At some point, difficult decisions have to be made. Nobody spoke. Michael looked pale. I realized with sudden horror that this conversation was not accidental. This was the reason for the dinner. This was the reason for the guests. This was the reason she invited people who barely knew us. She wanted witnesses. She wanted approval. She wanted the room on her side. And sitting there beneath the Christmas lights surrounded by strangers in my own home, I understood that after dinner, they intended to discuss my future. Without ever asking what I wanted, I looked toward the front windows. Snow was falling harder now. The Christmas tree glowed beside the fireplace. Ethan's chair remained hidden in the basement, and somewhere upstairs inside his desk, an unopened envelope still waited for me. I had no idea that within the next hour, my entire life would change. The dining room suddenly felt smaller. 22 people sat beneath the warm glow of Christmas lights, but the room had become painfully quiet. Outside, snow covered the windows. Inside, every fork rested motionless beside every plate. Vanessa still held her wine glass. She smiled as if she were making harmless conversation. "We all love summer," she said. "But eventually, people have to admit when they can no longer contribute." I felt Grace squeeze my hand beneath the table. One of the guests shifted uncomfortably. Michael looked at his plate. Nobody spoke. Vanessa continued. "Michael and I work very hard. We pay bills. We maintain the house. We make plans. And honestly, there comes a point when someone simply becomes—" She paused. I think she wanted the word to sound reasonable, practical, necessary. Instead, it sounded cruel. Useless. The word landed like shattered glass. For several seconds, I couldn't breathe. Perhaps everyone expected me to argue. Perhaps they expected tears. Instead, I simply stared at her. After 68 years of life, after raising a son, burying a husband, paying bills, sacrificing dreams, and carrying a family through difficult years, I had become a single word. Useless. One of the women near the end of the table lowered her eyes. A man cleared his throat. Michael whispered, "Vanessa." But she kept speaking. "I don't mean that in a cruel way. I mean, realistically. Summer doesn't cook anymore. She doesn't drive very much. She doesn't work. She needs help with things." I finally found my voice. "I still cook." She smiled. "The caterers cooked tonight." I cooked for 40 years. But not now. Every sentence felt like another stone placed upon my chest. Grace suddenly spoke. "That's enough." Vanessa looked at her. "I'm simply being honest." Grace's voice became colder. "Honesty and humiliation aren't the same thing." Several guests looked relieved that someone had spoken. But Vanessa seemed energized. Perhaps she believed everyone agreed with her. Perhaps she had practiced this speech. She placed her wine glass down. "Michael and I have been carrying responsibilities that nobody sees." I turned toward my son. He still refused to look at me. That hurt more than Vanessa's words, because cruelty from a stranger wounds you once. Silence from your child wounds you forever. Vanessa continued. "We've been discussing options that would allow Summer to receive proper care." Proper care. Another beautiful phrase. Another knife hidden inside kindness. I suddenly understood why these guests had been invited. Witnesses. She wanted people to see her as the responsible daughter-in-law. The caring woman making difficult decisions, and I was expected to play the role of the aging burden. One of the guests finally spoke. "What kind of options?" Vanessa smiled. "There are wonderful communities for seniors." The room became quiet again. Everyone now understood. Even strangers recognized what was happening. I looked toward Michael. "Did you know she was going to do this?" He swallowed. Mom, did you know? His silence answered me. I felt something inside me break. Not loudly, not dramatically, just quietly. Like old wood splitting beneath too much weight. I pushed my chair back. I think I should leave the table. Vanessa sighed. See, this is exactly what I mean. I looked at her. For the first time in months, truly looked at her. She was beautiful, confident, well-dressed, younger than me by almost 30 years. But suddenly, I noticed something else. Fear. Behind her confidence was fear. Behind her control was desperation. At the time, I didn't understand it. I only saw cruelty. I have lived in this house for 36 years, I said quietly. Nobody moved. I cared for my husband here. I raised my son here. I buried my parents while living here. I spent Christmases in this dining room before many of you even knew one another. My voice trembled. And tonight, I am sitting in my own home while strangers discuss where I should go. Vanessa crossed her arms. Nobody is attacking you. No, her expression hardened. We're trying to help. I nodded slowly. Then why do I feel ashamed? No one answered. Even Michael remained silent. That was the moment I realized I was entirely alone. Or so I thought. One of Vanessa's friends attempted to change the subject. The Christmas music still played quietly, the candles still burned, but the evening had already collapsed. Grace leaned toward me. Come sit in the kitchen. I shook my head. No, because if I left the table, I believed I would never return. I looked at Michael one final time. When your father died, I thought losing him would be the hardest thing I would ever experience. His eyes finally met mine. I was wrong. Tears filled his eyes, but he still said nothing. Vanessa spoke again. Summer, nobody wants to hurt you, but you have to admit that you don't really contribute anymore. There it was, again. Contribute, as if love were a business transaction, as if motherhood had monthly invoices, as if 40 years of sacrifice had expired. My hands began shaking. I looked down at them. These hands had changed diapers, cooked meals, worked late nights, held Ethan's hand in hospitals, held Michael after nightmares, buried parents, comforted friends. These hands were wrinkled now, slower, older, but useless. Never. I wanted to tell her that. I wanted to defend myself. Instead, tears began falling, quietly, embarrassingly. I hated crying in front of people, especially people who believed tears meant weakness. Grace stood. We're leaving. Vanessa looked irritated. Nobody asked you. Grace's eyes narrowed. Someone should have. Michael finally spoke. Can we please stop? Vanessa turned toward him. Why? Because everyone is finally hearing the truth. The truth. I looked around the table. Several guests avoided eye contact. One woman appeared close to tears. An older gentleman shook his head slightly. Nobody seemed comfortable, yet nobody stopped her. Because people often remain silent when witnessing cruelty. They hope someone else will intervene. I slowly pushed my chair backward. The room seemed distant. The Christmas lights blurred. I could hear my own heartbeat. I opened my mouth. For a moment, I almost told them about Ethan's envelope, about the desk, about my fears. about the strange feeling that something important remained hidden. But before I could speak, 3 loud knocks echoed through the house. Knock, knock, knock. The sound seemed to freeze everyone. No one moved. At first, I thought perhaps another guest had arrived. But who visits at nearly 8 o'clock on Christmas Eve? Vanessa frowned. We aren't expecting anyone. Another knock. Slow. Deliberate. The entire room became silent. Michael stood. I'll get it. For reasons I still cannot explain, my heart suddenly began racing. Something felt different, important, almost familiar. Michael walked toward the front door. Everyone watched. The Christmas music continued playing softly in the background. Snow fell outside the windows. The front door opened. Cold air entered the house. Michael stopped moving. I could only see the expression on my son's face. Shock. Complete shock. A man's voice spoke from the doorway. Good evening. The voice sounded older, calm, professional. I'm looking for Mrs. Summer West. Every person at the table turned toward me. Michael remained frozen. The stranger stepped inside. He carried a black leather briefcase. Snow covered his coat. He removed his hat. And when I finally saw his face, something deep inside my memory stirred. Because I had seen that man once before, many years earlier, standing beside my husband, and I suddenly realized that Christmas Eve was not ending. It was only beginning. The man standing in my doorway removed his black wool hat and brushed the snow from his shoulders. For a moment, nobody spoke. The dining room behind me had fallen completely silent. Even the Christmas music seemed distant now. Michael stood frozen beside the open door. The stranger looked directly at me. Mrs. Summer West. His voice was calm, professional, familiar. I slowly stood from my chair. Yes. He nodded politely. My name is Richard Bennett. The name struck me immediately, not because I knew him well, but because I had heard Ethan speak it years ago. Very few people from Ethan's business life ever entered our home. He had always separated work from family. Yet I distinctly remembered a tall man sitting with Ethan in his office one autumn afternoon, almost 15 years earlier. A legal matter, important documents, coffee served on a rainy day. Richard Bennett. The memory returned all at once. Richard looked around the room. I apologize for arriving during your Christmas dinner. Vanessa quickly recovered her composure. I'm sorry, but we're having a private family gathering. Richard nodded politely. I understand. He held his briefcase with both hands. But I was instructed to deliver certain documents to Mrs. West personally on Christmas Eve. The room became quiet again. Vanessa frowned. What documents? Richard looked at her. I'm sorry. These matters concern Mrs. West. The answer clearly irritated her. Michael stepped forward. My father passed away 7 years ago. Yes? And this concerns him? Richard's expression softened. It does. My heart suddenly began beating harder. Ethan, after all these years. Richard removed a pair of glasses from his coat pocket. I was Mr. Ethan West's attorney. Several guests exchanged glances. Vanessa slowly sat down. I could see uncertainty appearing in her eyes for the first time that evening. Richard continued. Your husband gave me specific instructions many years ago. My voice barely worked. Instructions? Yes. He paused. He instructed me to meet with you personally on Christmas Eve under certain circumstances. The words seemed impossible. Certain circumstances. I looked at Michael. He looked just as confused. Grace quietly moved closer to me. Richard glanced around the room. Perhaps we should speak privately. Vanessa immediately interrupted. We're family. Richard's eyes moved toward her. Mrs. West is my client. I am her daughter-in-law. He nodded politely. Even so, these matters belong to Mrs. West. For the first time all evening, Vanessa had no answer. I suddenly realized something. This man was not intimidated by her. Everyone else had spent months adjusting themselves to Vanessa's confidence. Richard had not. He simply stood there calmly, professionally, as if he had already anticipated resistance. I looked at him. Did Ethan send you? Richard's expression became gentler. He trusted me. Something inside me began to tremble. Not fear. Something else. Hope. He turned toward the dining room. I apologize again for the interruption. One of the guests spoke. Perhaps we should leave. Another nodded, but Richard raised his hand. That won't be necessary unless Mrs. West prefers privacy. 22 people waited for my answer. For the first time all evening, everyone was looking at me. Not Vanessa. Not Michael. Me. I took a slow breath. No. Richard nodded. As you wish. He followed me into the living room. Several guests remained at the table. Others quietly stood nearby. The Christmas tree lights reflected softly across the windows. Snow continued falling outside. Richard placed his briefcase on the coffee table. Then he looked directly at me. Mrs. West, when was the last time you opened your husband's office desk? My entire body became still. The desk. Yes. I swallowed. A few days ago. And did you find an envelope with your name on it? Every person in the room seemed to stop breathing. I slowly nodded. Yes. Richard smiled gently. Did you open it? No. I see. Vanessa spoke. What does this have to do with anything? Richard turned toward her. Everything. The room grew even quieter. He removed several documents from his briefcase. Then he took out a small sealed envelope. The handwriting on the front instantly brought tears to my eyes. Summer. It was Ethan's handwriting, not the envelope in the desk. A different one. My hands began shaking. Richard carefully handed it to me. Ethan asked me to give you this personally. I stared at the envelope. The last letter from my husband, 7 years after his death. Grace covered her mouth. Michael looked stunned. Even Vanessa seemed unable to speak. I carefully touched Ethan's handwriting. It felt impossible, as though time itself had returned. When did he write this? Richard answered quietly. 9 years ago. 9? Yeah, that was 2 years before Ethan died. The room felt smaller. The years between Ethan's death and that Christmas Eve suddenly collapsed. Richard sat down. Ethan arranged several legal matters before his passing. Michael spoke. Why didn't we know? Richard looked at him kindly. Because your father instructed me not to discuss them. Until now. Until now. Vanessa crossed her arms. This makes no sense. Richard opened a folder. Mr. West established a conditional trust and several legal instructions that could only be activated under specific circumstances. I heard Grace whisper softly. Oh my God. Michael sat down heavily. What circumstances? Richard looked at me. Mrs. West must be present. I am. The meeting must occur inside this house. I felt cold. This house? Yes. He looked toward the Christmas tree. And it must occur on Christmas Eve. No one spoke. The fire crackled softly. Outside, the wind blew against the windows. I suddenly remembered Ethan's strange behavior during his final Christmas. He had spent several evenings alone in his office. He had organized papers, met with Richard, locked drawers. At the time, I assumed he was preparing business documents. Perhaps he had been preparing something else. Vanessa finally spoke. What exactly are you saying? Richard folded his hands. I'm saying that Mr. West anticipated the possibility that one day Mrs. West might require certain protections. Protections? The word landed heavily. I felt Michael turn toward me. Vanessa laughed nervously. Protection from what? Richard did not answer immediately. Instead, he looked directly at me. Mrs. West, before we continue, I need to ask one question. My voice trembled. What question? He spoke carefully. Do you still reside in this home willingly? The room froze. I looked at Michael, at Vanessa, at Grace, at the guests, at the Christmas tree, at Ethan's empty place beside the fireplace. And for the first time in many months, I answered honestly. I don't know. Richard slowly nodded, as if he had expected that answer. He closed the folder. There is more to discuss. Vanessa leaned forward. What more? Richard's eyes moved toward her. Mr. West left instructions regarding this property, his estate, and the future inheritance of his family. Michael's face became pale. My inheritance. Richard looked at him quietly. Your father loved you very much. My son lowered his eyes. But your father also loved your mother. The silence that followed felt enormous. For the first time that evening, I saw genuine fear appear in Vanessa's face. Not anger, not irritation. Fear. Because whatever Ethan had prepared years earlier was no longer hidden. And somewhere upstairs, inside the desk, I had been afraid to open another envelope still waited. One that apparently contained answers my husband had protected for nearly a decade. Richard looked at me. I believe your husband wanted you to read it tonight. My heart began beating again. The entire house waited. The guests waited. Michael waited. Vanessa waited. And for the first time since Ethan died, I felt as though he had somehow returned home for Christmas. No one returned to the dining room. The turkey sat untouched. Wine glasses remained half full. The Christmas music had stopped sometime during the last 20 minutes, and now the only sounds inside the house were the crackling fireplace and the wind pushing snow against the windows. Richard Bennett sat quietly in Ethan's old chair. Nobody had invited him to sit there, yet somehow it felt right. For 7 years, that chair had remained empty. Now, on Christmas Eve, someone who had once known my husband occupied it. I still held Ethan's letter in my hands. My fingers trembled every time I looked at his handwriting. Summer. The way he always wrote my name. Michael sat across from me, pale and silent. Vanessa remained standing near the fireplace. The confidence she had carried all evening was slowly disappearing. Grace sat beside me. Richard opened his briefcase once again. Mrs. West, before we discuss the legal documents, I believe your husband wanted you to read his letter first. I nodded. The room felt strangely small. 22 people had entered my house expecting Christmas dinner. Now they were witnessing something entirely different. I carefully opened the envelope. Inside was a folded sheet of paper. I immediately recognized Ethan's handwriting. My vision blurred. For several seconds, I could not read. Then, I finally began. My dearest Summer, if you are reading this, then the moment I feared has finally arrived. My heart stopped. The room disappeared. There was only Ethan's voice. I know you better than anyone in this world. I know you will always put everyone else first. I know you will make excuses for people you love. And I know you will endure pain quietly long after you should speak. Tears fell onto the paper. I continued reading. If Richard has delivered this letter, it means you may have forgotten your own value. If that has happened, I need you to remember something. You built our family. You built our home. You built my life. Nobody spoke. Even Vanessa remained silent. Everything I achieved happened because you stood beside me. Never allow anyone to convince you that age makes you less valuable. Never allow anyone to make you feel like a guest in your own home. My breathing became uneven. I could almost hear Ethan speaking. And if our son has failed, you remember that loving someone does not mean surrendering yourself to them. I stopped reading. Michael lowered his head. The room was completely silent. Richard spoke softly. Ethan left several documents with me at the same time he wrote that letter. He opened a thick folder. Mrs. West, I need to confirm something before I continue. I looked up. Yes. Is the property located at 27 Maple Ridge Road still your primary residence? Yes. He nodded. Good. Vanessa suddenly spoke. What exactly is this about? Richard turned toward her. The ownership of this property. Michael looked confused. What about it? Richard adjusted his glasses. The property belongs entirely to Mrs. Summer West. The room became still. Vanessa blinked. What? The deed has always been in Mrs. West's name. Michael frowned. That can't be right. Richard calmly removed a document. It is correct. I stared at him. Ethan told me the house was ours. Richard smiled gently. It was emotionally yours, together. He looked at me. But legally, Ethan transferred ownership into your name years before his death. I couldn't speak. Ethan was concerned about your long-term protection. Michael looked stunned. You mean Mom owns everything? Richard folded his hands. The house, yes. Vanessa's face lost all color. But Michael is his son. Richard nodded. Yes. And eventually he inherits. Richard was quiet for a moment. Possibly. The word echoed through the room. Possibly. Michael stared at him. What does that mean? Richard removed another document. This is the West Family Trust. Grace whispered softly. Oh my goodness. Richard continued. Ethan placed several investment savings accounts and company assets into a trust approximately 6 years before his death. My heart began racing. I knew Ethan had done well financially, but we had always lived comfortably, not extravagantly. He rarely discussed money. How much? Michael asked quietly. Richard looked at me first. Mrs. West is the primary beneficiary. Vanessa interrupted. How much? Richard answered calmly. Several $1,000,000. The room exploded into silence. One of the guests gasped. Another covered her mouth. Michael looked as though he had stopped breathing. I felt dizzy. No, I whispered. Richard nodded. Your husband invested carefully over many years. I stared at him. Ethan never told me. He instructed me not to discuss the trust unless certain conditions occurred. Vanessa suddenly spoke. What conditions? Richard's expression changed. For the first time, his voice became colder. The mistreatment of Mrs. West. Nobody moved. I felt Michael look toward me. Richard opened another document. Ethan specifically included behavioral provisions. Michael frowned. Behavioral provisions. Yes. Richard looked directly at him. Your father believed inheritance should reflect character. My son's face became pale. Richard continued reading. If my son fails to provide dignity, respect, and protection to his mother, portions of his inheritance may be withheld. I closed my eyes. Ethan, my careful, quiet husband, he had seen something, years before any of this happened. Richard continued. If any person attempts to pressure Summer West into leaving her home against her wishes, their interest in the trust may be revoked. Vanessa spoke quickly. We never forced her. Richard looked at her. Were discussions held regarding assisted living facilities? Nobody answered. He continued. Were documents prepared regarding relocation? Silence. Michael lowered his head. Richard looked toward him. Michael? My son's voice was barely audible. Yeah, I felt my heart break. Not because I didn't know, because now everyone knew. Richard closed the file. Your father anticipated that circumstances might arise where Mrs. West would require protection from financial or emotional pressure. Vanessa folded her arms. This is ridiculous. No. Richard's voice remained calm. This is legal. She took a step forward. Michael is his son. And Summer is his wife. The words settled over the room. For years, I had felt invisible. Now, for the first time, someone was speaking for me. Richard opened another envelope. There is one final matter. Everyone watched him. Ethan instructed me to evaluate whether Mrs. West remained secure in her own home. I looked at him. What happens if I'm not? He answered quietly. The trust becomes immediately active. My hands shook. What does that mean? It means Mrs. West receives full financial control, immediate access to the trust assets, and sole authority over the property. Vanessa looked frightened now, truly frightened, not because of me, because of what she had just lost, or perhaps what she had never possessed. Michael finally spoke. Dad planned all this. Richard nodded. He loved your mother very much. My son began crying. I had not seen him cry since Ethan's funeral. Richard placed the documents carefully back inside his briefcase. There is still one matter unresolved. The room became quiet again. I looked at him. What matter? He spoke gently. Ethan also left instructions concerning anyone who attempted to obtain control of the property improperly. My heart skipped, because suddenly I remembered the missing files, the desk, the conversations, the paperwork. Vanessa slowly turned toward Michael. Michael looked confused. Richard opened one final folder, and for the first time that evening, he looked directly at Vanessa. Mrs. West, I believe we need to discuss several documents that have recently been prepared. The color drained from her face, and at that exact moment, I realized the evening was not finished. The truth was only beginning. No one spoke. For several seconds, all I could hear was the ticking of the grandfather clock in the hallway. Richard Bennett had just said that Ethan left instructions regarding anyone who tried to obtain control of my home improperly. And now he was looking directly at Vanessa. She crossed her arms. I don't know what you're implying. Richard calmly removed several papers from the folder. I'm not implying anything. He adjusted his glasses. I'm asking questions. Michael sat forward. What kind of questions? Richard looked at him. Have either of you recently prepared legal documents concerning your mother's residence? Michael hesitated. Vanessa answered immediately. We discussed options. Richard nodded. Were documents drafted? She remained silent. Mrs. West. Her jaw tightened. Yes. I felt my stomach twist. Michael turned toward her. You said they were informational. Vanessa looked at him. They were. Richard placed a document on the coffee table. Assisted living admission forms. Another document. Medical authorization requests. Another. Property consultation paperwork. I stared at the papers. I recognized the folder. The blue folder I had seen several days earlier. The one Vanessa quickly closed when I entered the room. Richard continued. These documents were prepared approximately 2 weeks ago. Michael looked shocked. You already filled them out. Vanessa's voice became defensive. I was planning ahead. For what? I asked. She looked at me. For reality. The word hurt. Reality. As though I had somehow become a problem that needed management. Richard folded his hands. Mrs. West, did Summer agree to these documents? No. Was she informed? No. Michael slowly turned toward his wife. You told me she knew. Vanessa looked away. I intended to tell her. Grace suddenly spoke. At Christmas dinner, no one answered. The room felt colder now. Many of the guests remained seated quietly, too uncomfortable to leave and too stunned to speak. Richard removed another paper. This is more concerning. Vanessa immediately stood. I think this conversation is inappropriate. Richard looked at her calmly. This document contains handwritten notes regarding the estimated market value of the property. Michael frowned. What? Richard continued. Several possible sale prices. My heart skipped. Sale prices? Vanessa shook her head. That doesn't mean anything. Richard looked at her. It suggests future plans. I turned toward Michael. He looked completely lost. You wanted to sell the house? His voice sounded small. No, Vanessa answered too quickly. We discussed possibilities. Michael stood. You told me the paperwork was for Mom's care. Vanessa's composure was beginning to crack. Because it was. Richard opened another folder. There is one additional matter. He looked directly at me. Mrs. West, have you signed any documents during the past 6 months? I thought carefully. No. He nodded. Good. Vanessa suddenly looked nervous. Very nervous. Richard continued. Several weeks ago, I received an inquiry from a local office regarding ownership verification. Michael frowned. What does that mean? It means someone requested information about the transfer of this property. I felt my pulse racing. Transfer? Michael looked at Vanessa. Her silence answered him. Vanessa. She looked away. I was just asking questions. Richard's voice became firmer. The request included a document bearing Mrs. West's signature. The entire room froze. I stared at him. My signature? Yes. No. I felt cold. I never signed anything. Richard carefully removed a copy. My name appeared at the bottom. Summer West. My breathing stopped. That was not my signature. It resembled it, but it was not mine. Michael looked horrified. What is this? Vanessa immediately spoke. It wasn't finalized? Richard remained calm. Because it was rejected. Grace covered her mouth. One of the guests whispered, "Oh my God." Michael turned toward his wife. Did you do this? No. Vanessa. I only copied her signature because I was gathering information. You forged my mother's name? Tears suddenly appeared in her eyes. Everything about her began changing. The confident woman who had controlled the evening was disappearing. I was trying to help us. Us? Michael said. She looked at him desperately. We're drowning. The room became silent again. Richard leaned back. Drowning. Vanessa wiped her eyes. We have debt. Michael stared at her. What? She looked at him. You know about some of it. Some? My son looked pale. How much? She hesitated. Almost $200,000. The room exploded. What? Michael whispered. Her voice broke. The credit cards. You told me 40,000? The business loans? What business? The investments. Michael stepped backward. There was no investment. Vanessa began crying. I was trying to fix everything. The pieces suddenly began fitting together. The expensive furniture, the parties, the designer clothes, the endless deliveries, the obsession with the house. Grace quietly whispered, Dear God. Vanessa sat down. Her shoulders shook. I thought if we sold the house. I looked at her. My house. She couldn't meet my eyes. Richard spoke gently. Did Michael know? Vanessa answered. No. My son closed his eyes. For several moments, nobody moved. I looked at Michael. He seemed older, smaller, as though his entire marriage had collapsed in front of him. He turned toward me. Mom, I swear I didn't know. I believed him, not because he deserved it, because I could see the truth. He had been weak, passive, afraid, but he had not known. That realization hurt in a different way. Because if Michael had been cruel, perhaps I could hate him. Instead, he had simply failed me. Richard finally spoke. Ethan anticipated financial pressure. Everyone looked at him. He believed money causes people to reveal themselves. He opened one final page. In the event of fraud, coercion, or attempted property transfer, the affected beneficiary forfeits certain inheritance rights. Vanessa stared at him. What does that mean? It means your interest in the trust may be void. Her face lost all color. Michael looked confused. My interest? Richard looked at him. Your father required honesty. My son sat down slowly. Everything had changed. The guests no longer looked at me with pity. They looked at Vanessa with disbelief. The woman who had called me useless an hour earlier now sat crying in my living room. The woman who wanted to move me from my home had been planning to save herself. And suddenly, I understood something. Vanessa had never hated me. She had feared me, because as long as I remained in this house, she could never control it. As long as I stayed, the future she wanted could not happen. The realization brought me no joy, only sadness, because somewhere along the way, greed had become more important to her than family. Michael slowly stood. He looked at his wife, then at me. His eyes were filled with tears. I don't know what to do. For the first time all evening, no one answered him. Not Richard, not Grace, not me, because some choices belong to us alone. Richard closed his briefcase. The legal matters can wait until tomorrow. He looked at me. But Mrs. West deserves peace tonight. Peace. The word felt almost unfamiliar. Outside, snow continued falling. Christmas lights glowed softly throughout the room. The guests sat quietly, and for the first time in many months, nobody was asking me to leave my home. Nobody was calling me useless. Nobody was deciding my future. Yet one question still remained. Michael looked at me, his voice barely above a whisper. Mom. Tears rolled down his face. Can you ever forgive me? And I realized that the hardest part of Christmas had not yet begun. Nobody moved. The Christmas tree still glowed beside the fireplace. Melted wax slowly dripped down the candles on the dining table. Outside, snow continued falling across Maple Ridge Road, covering the neighborhood in silence. Inside my home, an entirely different storm had begun. Vanessa sat on the edge of the sofa, her hands trembling. Michael stood near the window, staring into the darkness. Richard Bennett had closed his briefcase, but the weight of his words still hung over everyone. Fraud, forgery, debt. The room no longer belonged to Christmas. It belonged to truth. One of the guests quietly stood. I think we should leave. Another couple followed. Soon, coats were being collected. People whispered polite goodbyes. Nobody mentioned the dinner. Nobody mentioned the argument. Nobody looked directly at Vanessa. As each guest walked past me, several gently touched my shoulder. One woman squeezed my hand. I'm sorry. Another whispered, You didn't deserve that? For the first time that night, I realized something. People had not agreed with Vanessa. They had simply been uncomfortable. Cruelty often survives because good people remain silent. Within 20 minutes, only 6 people remained in the house. Me, Michael, Vanessa, Grace, Richard, and Olivia Bennett, Richard's daughter, who had arrived to drive him home because of the snow. The house suddenly felt enormous. Vanessa finally broke the silence. You don't understand. Nobody answered. She looked at Michael. We were losing everything. He turned toward her. What exactly were we losing? She wiped her eyes. The condo. My son frowned. What? The mortgage payments. I paid them. Not all of them. Michael looked confused. What are you talking about? Vanessa stood. For the first time since I had known her, she looked frightened instead of confident. She walked toward her purse and removed several envelopes. Bills, statements, collection notices. She handed them to Michael. As he read them, the color slowly disappeared from his face. These can't be real. They are. Credit cards. She nodded. Business loans. Another nod. Personal loans. Tears rolled down her cheeks. Michael looked up. $200,000? She whispered, closer to 3. Grace covered her mouth. Even Richard looked surprised. I sat quietly, listening, watching, because suddenly the woman who had controlled my home for 2 years was falling apart. Michael walked across the room. When she looked down, over the last 4 years. 4 years? I thought I could fix it. His voice rose. Fix it how? She looked toward me. Nobody missed the meaning. The house. My house. Vanessa finally spoke the truth. I thought if we sold this place. Michael interrupted. You thought you could sell my mother's home? No. Then what? Her voice cracked. I thought if Summer moved somewhere smaller, we could help manage things. I finally spoke. Manage? She looked at me. I wasn't trying to hurt you. Then why did you call me useless? Tears filled her eyes. I was angry. At me? No. She lowered her head. At myself. The room became quiet again. Richard leaned forward. Mrs. West, did your husband know about these debts? Michael looked confused. What husband? Richard looked at Vanessa. Your father? She shook her head. He died before most of it happened. Richard nodded slowly. Olivia, who had remained quiet until then, finally spoke. I work in financial recovery. Everyone looked at her. She continued carefully. People in serious debt often begin making decisions from fear. Vanessa wiped her eyes. I wasn't trying to steal. Richard's daughter looked at her kindly. No, but you were trying to survive. I suddenly remembered something. Months earlier, I had found Vanessa crying in her car. When I asked what was wrong, she said she was tired. Another afternoon, I saw her tearing up credit card statements before throwing them away. At the time, I thought nothing of it. Now, everything made sense. The expensive furniture, the parties, the perfect image, the endless need to appear successful. She had been building a life she could no longer afford. And somewhere along the way, my home became her solution. Michael sat down heavily. You lied to me. She nodded. I know. You forged Mom's signature. She cried harder. I never filed anything. But you signed her name. She couldn't answer. The silence said enough. After several minutes, Richard spoke. Mrs. West. Vanessa looked up. The trust documents are very clear. Her eyes widened. Meaning? If fraud or coercion occurred, Ethan authorized immediate legal protection for Summer. She swallowed. What happens now? Richard looked toward me. That depends on Mrs. West. Everyone turned toward me. For nearly 2 years, decisions had been made around me. Now, every eye waited for my answer. The responsibility felt heavy. I looked at Vanessa. She looked smaller than I had ever seen her. Not powerful, not cruel, broken. But being broken does not erase the damage we cause. I stood slowly. My legs felt weak. Yet something inside me felt stronger than it had in years. I spent my entire life trying to keep peace. No one spoke. I made excuses for everyone. I looked at Michael. I excused silence. Then I looked at Vanessa. I excused disrespect. Tears rolled down her face. I continued. When Ethan died, I thought I had lost my partner. My voice trembled. But somewhere during the past 2 years, I lost myself. The room was perfectly quiet. I allowed people to move my memories. I looked toward the basement. I allowed people to move my husband's chair. I looked around the living room. I allowed people to change my home. Finally, I looked directly at Vanessa. But I will not allow anyone to decide whether I deserve to live here. Vanessa began crying harder. I'm sorry. The words finally came. Simple, small, late, but real. I sat down again. My body suddenly felt exhausted. Richard looked at his watch. It's almost midnight. Christmas. Somehow Christmas had arrived. Grace smiled gently. Ethan certainly knew how to make an entrance. For the first time that evening, I laughed. A small laugh, but real. Richard smiled. Your husband was a careful man. I nodded. He was. Michael looked at me. Mom. His voice broke. I'm sorry. I saw the little boy he used to be, the child who climbed into my lap during thunderstorms, the boy who cried when his dog died, the young man who held my hand at Ethan's funeral. But I also saw the man who remained silent while his wife humiliated me. Both versions were true, and that was the hardest part. Vanessa suddenly stood. I'll leave. Everyone looked at her. She picked up her coat. Michael rose. Where will you go? She shrugged. I don't know. The answer frightened me, because for the first time all evening, she looked completely alone. Grace quietly whispered beside me, Be careful. I understood what she meant. Compassion does not require surrender. Forgiveness does not require forgetting. Vanessa looked at me. I never hated you. I said nothing. She continued. I hated feeling like I was failing. The tears in her eyes seemed genuine, but the wounds inside me were genuine too. Richard stood. I suggest everyone rest tonight. He looked toward me. Tomorrow, we discuss legal matters. I nodded. Michael looked at his wife. Vanessa looked at the floor. And as midnight approached, I realized something unexpected. The woman who called me useless had finally revealed her own deepest fear. She had never been afraid of me. She had been terrified that everything she built was collapsing, and now it had. But the most difficult decision of all still remained, because tomorrow I would have to decide whether Vanessa West could remain in my home, or whether Christmas night would become the last night she ever slept under my roof. I barely slept that night. After Richard and Olivia left, after Grace finally convinced me to try to rest, and after the last Christmas candle burned itself out, I lay awake in my downstairs bedroom, listening to the silence. The house had never felt so different. For years after Ethan died, the silence had felt lonely. That night, it felt honest. No pretending, no smiling through pain, no convincing myself that everything was fine. Just truth. Somewhere upstairs, Michael was awake. I could hear footsteps, doors opening and closing, the low sound of voices. Vanessa had not left. Not yet. Around 3 o'clock in the morning, I heard someone crying. At first, I thought it was Vanessa, but then I realized it was my son. That sound broke my heart more than anything that had happened during dinner, because no mother ever truly stops hearing her child cry. Even when that child is 42 years old, I finally fell asleep just before dawn. When I woke, sunlight reflected off the snow outside my window. Christmas morning had arrived. The irony almost made me laugh. For the first time in my life, Christmas morning felt less like a holiday and more like the aftermath of a storm. I slowly walked upstairs. The house was quiet. The beautiful dining table from the night before remained untouched. Half-empty glasses still sat beside cold plates. Wrapping paper lay beneath the tree. Nobody had opened presents. I stood there for several moments. This room had witnessed the worst night of my life, and yet the Christmas lights still glowed softly. Life continued. It always does. I walked into the kitchen. Michael sat alone at the table. He looked exhausted. His eyes were red. A coffee cup sat untouched beside him. When he saw me, he stood immediately. Mom! I nodded. Neither of us knew where to begin. Finally, he spoke. I didn't sleep. Neither did I. He looked down. I'm sorry. The words came quietly, not as a defense, not as an excuse, just pain. I sat across from him. For a long moment, we simply looked at each other. I suddenly saw the little boy who used to sit at the same table, eating cereal before school. The teenager who asked me for advice about his first girlfriend. The young man who cried when Ethan died. And the middle-aged man who had failed to protect his mother. All of those people existed at once. I need to ask you something, I said. He nodded. Did you really want me to leave this house? His eyes immediately filled with tears. No. Then why didn't you stop her? He looked away. I kept telling myself things would get better. I said nothing. I thought Vanessa was stressed. His voice shook. I thought if I avoided the arguments, eventually everything would calm down. I nodded slowly, because I finally understood. Michael had not chosen Vanessa over me. He had chosen peace over courage, and sometimes those choices destroy families. I was afraid, he whispered. Of what? Losing my marriage. I looked at him carefully. And what did you lose instead? He closed his eyes. Myself. We sat quietly. The clock in the kitchen ticked softly. Snow fell outside. Then he said something I never expected. I think Vanessa and I are finished. My heart sank, not because I loved Vanessa, but because I loved my son. What happened? He looked exhausted. She lied to me. His voice cracked. About the money, about the debt, about the documents. He rubbed his face. I didn't even know who she was last night. I understood that feeling. For months, I had watched Vanessa become someone I no longer recognized. Perhaps Michael had been watching too. He simply refused to see it. Where is she? I asked. Packing. I looked toward the stairs. She's leaving. He nodded. She says she needs to stay with her sister. Neither of us spoke, because regardless of everything that had happened, the end of a marriage is still a funeral of sorts. Around 9 o'clock, Vanessa finally came downstairs. She carried 2 suitcases. She looked completely different. No makeup, no carefully styled hair, no expensive jewelry. For the first time since I had met her, she looked vulnerable. She stopped when she saw me. Summer. I waited. She placed the suitcases beside the front door. Then she turned toward me. I don't expect forgiveness. I remained silent. She took a deep breath. When I married Michael, I wanted everything to be perfect. Her voice trembled. I wanted the beautiful house, the perfect life, the successful husband. She looked around the room. When money became difficult, I kept pretending. Tears appeared again. And eventually, pretending became lying. Michael stood quietly behind her. I was ashamed. She looked directly at me, and every time I looked at you, I saw someone who survived things I couldn't survive. I frowned slightly. What do you mean? She wiped her eyes. You lost your husband. She swallowed. You lost people you loved. She looked down. You struggled. Her voice became quieter. And somehow you stayed strong. I had never considered that. She continued. I was terrified all the time. The room remained silent. I thought money would fix it. She shook her head. Then I thought your house would fix it. She looked directly at me. It was never really about you. Perhaps that should have comforted me. It didn't, because pain caused by fear still hurts. Vanessa stepped closer. I am sorry I called you useless. Her voice broke. Because the truth is, I felt useless. Nobody spoke. Michael looked devastated. I looked at the woman who had humiliated me, and for the first time, I saw not a villain, but a frightened person who had allowed fear to become greed. That understanding did not erase the damage, but it changed something. She handed me a small envelope. What is this? I asked. The copies. I opened it. Inside were every document she had prepared, every forged signature, every form torn into pieces. I destroyed everything. I nodded. She looked at Michael. I'm sorry. He couldn't answer, because some wounds are too fresh for words. She picked up her suitcases. Then she looked at me one final time. I hope one day you can remember me differently. I honestly didn't know if I could. She opened the front door. Cold air entered the house. Snowflakes drifted inside. And then she was gone. The front door closed quietly behind her. Nobody moved. My son stood in the middle of the living room, completely still. 30 minutes passed before he finally spoke. I failed you. I looked at him. Yes, the truth hurt, but truth was all we had left. Tears rolled down his face. I don't know how to fix it. For a long moment, I said nothing. Then I answered honestly. You don't. He looked at me. You live differently. The room became quiet. Outside, church bells began ringing. Christmas morning. A new day, a new beginning. But forgiveness, I realized, would not arrive today. Because trust that takes years to break cannot be rebuilt overnight. And as Michael sat alone beneath the Christmas tree crying quietly in the house where he grew up, I understood that my son had finally reached the moment Ethan feared most. The moment when a man must decide who he truly wants to become. The house felt strangely quiet after Vanessa left. For nearly 2 years, her voice had filled every room. Her plans, her schedules, her opinions, her decisions. Now there was only silence. The kind of silence that arrives after a storm, has destroyed something, and moved on. Michael spent most of Christmas Day upstairs in his old bedroom. I remained downstairs. Neither of us seemed to know how to exist together. Grace stayed through the afternoon. She helped clean the dining room. We put away dishes, wrapped leftovers, extinguished candles. The ordinary work felt comforting. Sometimes the simplest tasks help people survive difficult days. At one point, Grace stopped beside the fireplace. Summer. I looked up. Yes. She held Ethan's photograph. When was the last time this picture was upstairs? I stared at it. The framed photograph had sat beside Ethan's chair for years. At some point, Vanessa had moved it downstairs. I honestly couldn't remember when. Grace gently placed it back on the mantel. Leave it there. Something inside me shifted. After she left that evening, I walked slowly through the house. The living room, the dining room, the kitchen. For the first time in months, I looked carefully at everything. The new decorations, the expensive furniture, the modern artwork. So much of it felt unfamiliar. This had happened gradually, one small change at a time, one compromise at a time, one moment of silence at a time. I suddenly understood something. Nobody takes your place all at once. You surrender it piece by piece. And I had surrendered far too much. That evening, I walked downstairs to the basement. The old light bulb still hung above Ethan's chair. Dust covered the leather. The chair looked lonely. For several moments, I simply stood there. Then I pulled it toward the stairs. The chair was heavier than I remembered. Halfway up, Michael appeared. "Mom." I looked up. He immediately understood. Without speaking, he picked up one side. Together, we carried Ethan's chair back into the living room. Neither of us said anything. We simply placed it beside the fireplace, where it belonged. Michael stared at it. I should never have let her move this. I sat down in the chair. The leather creaked softly. For the first time in nearly 2 years, I felt as though Ethan had returned to his proper place. "You're right," I said. Michael lowered his head. The truth hurt him, but I was tired of protecting everyone from truth. That night we ate dinner together, just the two of us. Soup, bread, coffee, nothing special. Yet it felt more like Christmas than the previous evening. At one point, Michael finally spoke. "What happens now?" I looked at him. "What do you mean?" "With us." The question remained between us. Mother, son, trust, disappointment, love, all tangled together. I took a slow breath. "I don't know." He nodded. "I deserve that." "Yes." Tears appeared again. "I don't know how to fix this." I thought about Ethan, about his letter, about the years we spent together, about the man who had somehow seen this future before any of us. "Your father once told me something." Michael looked up. "He said character isn't revealed when life is easy." I paused. "He said character appears when doing the right thing costs something." Michael stared at the table. "And I failed." "Yes." The honesty surprised even me. For months, I had avoided difficult conversations. I had softened everything, excused everything, minimized everything. No more. Michael wiped his eyes. "I watched her hurt you." "Yes." "I knew she wanted you to leave." "Yes." "I did nothing." I nodded. The room remained quiet. Finally, I said something I had never said to my son before. "You broke my heart." He closed his eyes, not because he disagreed, because he knew it was true. For several minutes, neither of us spoke. Then he whispered, "I'm sorry." I believed him, but belief and healing are not the same thing. The following morning, Richard Bennett returned. Olivia came with him. They sat with me in Ethan's office. Michael joined us. Richard placed several folders on the desk. "The trust is now active." I still struggled to understand those words. "What exactly does that mean?" Olivia explained gently. "It means you have complete financial control." I looked surprised. "I always had that." Richard nodded. "Ethan wanted to ensure your independence." Michael sat quietly. Richard continued. "There is no immediate legal action necessary." I felt relieved. "And Vanessa," Richard folded his hands. "That depends on you." I thought carefully. Despite everything, I didn't want revenge. I wanted peace. "I don't want to hurt her." Richard nodded. Ethan didn't want revenge either. That answer surprised me. "He didn't." "No." Richard smiled softly. "He wanted protection." Protection, not punishment. That sounded exactly like Ethan. After they finished reviewing the documents, Richard handed me another envelope. "This one was also left by your husband." I looked down. My hands trembled. Another letter. Should I read it now? Richard smiled. He wanted you to decide. After they left, I remained alone in Ethan's office. Sunlight entered through the windows. Dust floated quietly through the air. The house felt different now. Lighter. Not healed, but changing. I opened the second letter. The first line made me cry immediately. Summer, if you are reading this, then you finally remembered who you are. I covered my mouth. Tears fell onto the paper. You spent your entire life taking care of everyone else. Now it is your turn. I read slowly. Every sentence felt like Ethan speaking beside me. Do not confuse kindness with surrender. Do not confuse love with obedience. And never allow someone else's fear to become your burden. I closed my eyes because for 2 years I had carried Vanessa's fears, her debt, her anxiety, her ambition, and I had almost lost myself doing it. That afternoon, I walked through the house again. This time, I made decisions. The downstairs bedroom would no longer be mine. My room upstairs would become mine again. The family photographs would return. The old ornaments would come back next Christmas. Ethan's books would return to the shelves. My mother's teacups would return to the kitchen, one item at a time. One memory at a time. One piece of myself at a time. That evening, Michael stood in the doorway of Ethan's office. I found an apartment. I looked up. You don't have to leave. He nodded slowly. I think I do. My heart hurt, but I understood. He continued. I need to learn how to stand on my own. I saw tears in his eyes. I need to become someone Dad would respect. I looked at my son, the frightened little boy, the weak husband, the broken man, and perhaps finally the man he still had time to become. For the first time since Christmas Eve, I stood and hugged him. He cried against my shoulder. And I realized something important. Forgiveness had not arrived, not yet. But truth had. And sometimes truth is the first step home. January arrived quietly. The Christmas decorations remained in the house longer than usual that year. Neither Michael nor I had the energy to take them down immediately. The tree still stood beside the fireplace. The stockings still hung from the mantel. But everything else had changed. Michael moved into a small apartment across town during the second week of January. He insisted it was necessary. I need to figure out who I am, he told me. Part of me wanted him to stay. Another part understood that healing sometimes requires distance. On the morning he left, we carried boxes to his car together. The winter air was cold. Snow covered the lawn. As he placed the final box into the trunk, he turned toward me. I don't expect things to go back to normal. I nodded. Neither do I. His eyes filled with sadness. I miss Dad. The words surprised me, because for weeks we had talked about Vanessa, the house, the trust, and the mistakes that had been made. But underneath everything, there was still grief. Ethan, the man who had held our family together. The man who had somehow protected me even after his death. I miss him too, I said. Michael looked at the house. I think he saw something in me that I never saw. What? He swallowed. Weakness. I immediately wanted to defend him. Mothers do that automatically, but I stopped myself because honesty had become important. Maybe, He nodded. But he also believed I could become better. That, I thought, sounded exactly like Ethan. Before leaving, Michael walked into the living room. He stood beside his father's chair. "I'll come visit." "Good." He smiled sadly. "If you'll have me." I looked at my son. The distance between us still existed. The hurt remained, but something else had returned. Truth. And truth gives people a chance. "You'll always be my son." Tears filled his eyes. "Thank you." He left shortly afterward. I stood at the front window and watched his car disappear. For the second time in my life, I felt the strange emptiness of an adult child leaving home. The first time had been joyful. This time felt necessary. The following weeks became unexpectedly peaceful. I moved back into my bedroom upstairs. The first night felt strange. For nearly 2 years, I had lived downstairs, slowly convincing myself it was temporary. Now, I slept again in the room Ethan and I had shared. His side of the bed remained empty, but it no longer felt abandoned. One afternoon, I opened every box that Vanessa had packed away. Photographs, quilts, ornaments, old books, family letters. I spent hours placing things back where they belonged. My mother's teacups returned to the kitchen. Ethan's books returned to the shelves. Michael's childhood photographs returned to the hallway. The house slowly became mine again. Or perhaps it had always been mine. I was simply reclaiming it. Grace visited often. She helped me organize closets. She drank coffee with me. One afternoon she smiled and said, "You look younger." I laughed. "I've aged 10 years. "No." She shook her head. "You've stopped disappearing." The words stayed with me, because that was exactly what had happened. I had disappeared. Not physically, emotionally, gradually, quietly. And now I was returning. Toward the end of January, I received a phone call. Vanessa. I stared at the screen for several moments before answering. "Hello?" Her voice sounded smaller. "Thank you for answering." I sat down. "How are you?" There was a long silence. "I'm working." "That's good." "I'm staying with my sister." I nodded, even though she couldn't see me. "Michael told me." Again, silence. Then she said something unexpected. "I started seeing a counselor." I didn't know what to say. She continued. "They said I've spent most of my life pretending." I listened quietly. "My father lost everything when I was young." Her voice trembled. "We were homeless for almost a year." I closed my eyes. She had never told us that. After that, I promised myself I would never be poor. I finally understood. The fear, the obsession, the appearances, the spending, the need to control. She continued. "When I saw your house, your marriage, your memories," her voice broke. "I wanted what you had." I said nothing. Then I became afraid of losing it. She began crying softly. And I became someone I don't recognize. The woman who had called me useless suddenly sounded very lost. I didn't excuse what she had done, but understanding entered the room. Sometimes people hurt others because they are terrified themselves. That truth doesn't erase responsibility, but it changes anger. "I am sorry, Summer." This time, the words felt different, not defensive, not desperate, simply true. "I know," she cried quietly. "I don't expect forgiveness." "No." I just wanted you to know. After we ended the call, I sat alone in the kitchen for a long time. Forgiveness remained far away. But hatred had begun to leave. In February, Richard Bennett visited one final time. We sat together in Ethan's office. He reviewed several documents. The trust had officially transferred. The legal protections were complete. Everything Ethan had prepared had worked exactly as he intended. Before leaving, Richard smiled. Your husband was an extraordinary man. I looked toward Ethan's photograph. Yes. Richard hesitated. There is something he told me years ago. I looked up. What? Richard smiled softly. He said that one day, Summer would forget how strong she is. My eyes filled with tears.